We are almost at the end of Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
As a fan base, we still haven't reached a consensus about whether or not Phase 4 has been good or bad, significant or not.
Okay, a lot of folks are saying it was bad.
I do agree. A lot of folks are saying that, and movie titles like The Eternals aren't helping because they seem like a one-off with no connection to the multiversal saga we're right then in the middle of.
But we don't buy that. Papa Feige has been planting Easter eggs this entire time. So today, we're going to use those and show you how the Eternals are going to be an important part of the MCU moving forward.
And specifically, how that significance may pay off as soon as the next MCU installment, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever.
I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Malcolm.
And we've got a lot to talk about.
We all know that Atlantis, or in this case, Talocan, is located at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, but that wasn't always the case. Atlantis used to be a part of the surface world.
That's right. Atlantis was actually the capital city for a string of islands in the Atlantic Ocean that included places like Avalon and Ruta. Meanwhile, off the coast of the Pacific Ocean, there was a small continent called Lemuria. Only instead of thriving like Atlantis, the Lemurian people were conquered and enslaved by none other than the deviant race. More on them later.
That's right. The Deviants continued their conquest of Earth until finally Atlantis was the only human civilization that remained free. At this time, Atlantis was being ruled by King Kamu and wife Queen Zarta. We think there are a lot of possibilities for the future of the MCU that's tied to that history.
In Submariner 62, the Deviant sent an army to attack Atlantis. In an effort to protect his empire, King Kamu opened magma pits below his city to fend off the incoming Lemurian invaders. Now, they were successful, but they also triggered massive seismological upheavals.
And at the same time, the Celestials paid a visit to Earth. They called this visit the second host, and by our best guess, they chose that name because it was their second time being hosted by the planet. Here, they parked over the continent of Lemuria to observe what the Deviants were doing and what they were up to. When they were noticed, though, the Deviants attacked them immediately.
So the Celestials retaliated.
Yeah, they sent a super strong weapon to Lemuria. The combination of intense shock waves from this weapon and the disturbances already happening under Atlantis proved too much for the planet.
This is what Marvel historians call the Great Cataclysm. Lemuria and Atlantis both sank to the bottom of the ocean, with the exception of a few small Atlantean isles such as Avalon.
That's right. So basically, the war between the Deviants and the Celestials is what caused the fall of Atlantis. That seems important, but as we get to know Namor and the Kingdom of Talocan and Wakanda Forever, I find it really hard to believe that we won't get at least a little bit of that history referenced.
Either way, the potential connections don't stop there. The second host is also when we met the Dreaming Celestial, aka Tiamat, and he was first seated in the Earth.
In the comics, we know Tiamat emerges off the coast of California. Notably, in the MCU, they made a point to change that location to the Indian Ocean, exactly where the fallen continent of Lemuria would have been.
This is less convincing. The MCU's version of events, instead of using a weapon to destroy Lemuria, they used the seeding of Tiamat to get the job done. To add yet another layer to this, sometimes in the comics, the Eternals and Celestials are responsible for sending the meteorite to Wakanda that gives them vibranium. So why not knock out 3 birds with one giant Tiamat stone?
Let's also mention that pretty much every time we see a deviant emerge in the Eternals movie, they make a point to emerge from water.
Also in this movie, we meet the Celestial Arishem the Judge. Both in the comics and in the movie, he is a Celestial responsible for all of the hosts on Earth. But this is where we're going to diverge from the film's dogma just a bit.
To be clear, we're not necessarily saying that the history Arishem provides about creating the Deviants and the Eternals is false. But we are saying what we believe he left out some stuff.
And according to the comics, for each host planet, there are 4 hosts, or 4 tests that the Celestials will do.
On the first visit, they identify the dominant species. Then the Celestials add variants to the species' genetic makeup. On Earth, humans were identified as the dominant species. And that genetic variance? Yeah, that's what we call the X gene, my friends.
Now, before the Eternals movie came out, this was everywhere. But for some reason, even though we're about to meet Namor, one of Marvel's first mutants, in the comics and in the films, no one is talking about this. I mean, how do you think that the Atlantean people learned to survive and evolve to breathe underwater?
Unlike the mutations they gave the Deviants or the Eternals, we also know from the comics that the version of the X gene placed in humans was meant to be latent. It had no immediate effect on them. This is similar to the way our friend Bruno talks about Kamala's mutation gene in Ms. Marvel.
Now, of course, it's unclear whether or not the MCU plans to keep this origin or not, but it sure does seem fitting that this is how we're going to meet one of Marvel's first mutants.
Assuming we believe Arishem, he still created both the Deviants and the Eternals, presumably during the first host. There's no reason to believe that their experiments on human genetics didn't happen, especially when we know to expect that to be a massive theme in Phase 5.
Oh, wait, are you still thinking about the whole we don't meddle in human affairs thing? Because, funny story, that doesn't happen until after the third host.
Thor, annual number 7, shows us that the third host actually happened about 1,000 years ago, guess where? Near the ancient Aztecian Empire.
The Celestials were essentially conducting an experiment on Earth, so once they noticed that the other gods started interfering in the course of human development, they got a little mad. The Eternals landed on Earth and immediately picked up this conflict. After a lot of fighting, the Eternals decided to leave a single god behind in various civilizations.
This is when suddenly the comic does something interesting. The Eternals fly right overhead the Mayan Empire and leave none other than Talocan.
We recognize that we see part of the fall of the Aztec Empire in the Eternals film, and that this moment isn't shown to us. But honestly, we don't see the Mayan Empire and get very little information about what is actually happening. So perhaps they're waiting to give us this until Wakanda Forever, as we learn about Namor.
Additionally, something in that moment triggers Athena's mad weary, almost like she's seen this happen before. Which is actually a lot like what happens to Hunter C-20 in Loki after Sylvie restores some of her memories that have been erased by the TVA. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that, but it does seem to raise some questions for me.
Also, in Hulk 3, we see Talocan imagined as an actual featherhead serpent, so this leads us to believe that the Talocan we see on the page in Thor Annual 7 is his avatar, just like how Black Panther is the avatar of Bast or Moon Knight, the avatar of Khonshu.
Now, before we keep going, let's pause for a second. We know that Wakanda Forever changes Atlantis to Talocan and tells us, the audience, that Namor is referred to as Talocan, possibly being his avatar. More evidence of that, even though that never happens in the comics.
We think they chose to make this transition to do more than just give Atlantis specific cultural ties. We think they did this to increasingly develop the history between Namor and the Celestials. If Namor is the avatar for Talocan in the MCU, then he not only has had his home destroyed with the Celestials, but the god he serves has been in this conflict for generations.
In addition to that, the outcome of the third host was an agreement among the Celestials and those gods to leave Earth alone and stop interfering.
We found this particularly interesting, given that we just saw Thor Love and Thunder show us so many gods that turned their back on Earth. Could it be that the Celestials were at least partially responsible for making this happen?
This was the last time the Celestials visited Earth, that is until the end of the Eternals, where Arishem comes back, kidnaps our heroes, and vows to cast judgment on the worthiness of our dear planet to survive. This, my friends, is the fourth host.
But before we get into what we believe that Arishem may have in store for Earth next, let's take a minute to appreciate the last 20,000 years, because we still have to talk about the founding of Wakanda.
Let's set the scene.
In Doctor Strange, Sorcerer Supreme number 33, Doctor Strange and Clea get thrown into a time warp and escape into ancient Egypt during a massive civil war. Much of the city was on fire, which causes Doctor Strange to immediately think about the legend of the burning library of Alexandria.
Now, if you don't know, this is one of the most significant libraries in history, with the books of all people of the world, including research on alchemy, transmutation, and sorcery.
Now, when they arrive, they are told by Julius Caesar and Cleopatra that the library was on fire. This, we find out, wasn't true. Instead, much of the city, including a nearby warehouse, was on fire, which is likely what turned into this famous legend.
When they arrived at the library, they found the scroll of Ashanti. Later, the Book of Ashanti. It is revealed to the readers that the other content of the library was mostly saved by the Eternals and stored on Olympus. Some caches didn't end up with them, though. Instead, they went south and west, one being stored in the Library of Atlantis and the other leading to the foundation of Wakanda.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here. First, in Moon Knight, we got more familiar with Egyptian gods and history, but most notably, we discovered Alexander the Great's missing tomb. If you don't know, the Library of Alexandria belongs to him.
In the Multiverse of Madness, we saw Doctor Strange and Clea disappear together into the Dark Dimension after we saw the Book of Ashanti get destroyed. It's possible that we eventually see them pick up on another adventure that leads them right to the Library of Alexandria in an attempt to restore it.
Now, as far as Wakanda Forever goes, we may not see this play out on the screen, but this is the kind of connection that we shouldn't just ignore moving forward.
Wakanda Forever has the potential to explore these histories between these two empires, and at least according to the comics, there's no way to do that without mentioning the Celestials.
Of course, 2 weeks from now, we'll all know if they decide to actually include any of this in the movie.
Of course, Lindsay and I are very sure about this and think we're right, but let us know what you think. Write down in the comments.